4 billion years ago, the chaos had finally quieted. The Earth, once a glowing sphere of molten rock, had begun to cool. The sky, once choked with smoke and volcanic ash, now swirled with heavy clouds. And from those clouds came rain. Endless, relentless rain. It fell for thousands of years, turning the blackened crust into rivers, filling the cracks of continents still forming, and finally pooling into the first great oceans. These waters were not blue as we know them today. They were murky, greenish, and full of minerals, a chemical soup stirred by lightning, heat, and time. And in this vast ocean of chaos, something extraordinary was about to happen. For the first time in Earth's history, matter itself would begin to organize. The universe, through chemistry, would start to write the first lines of biology. It began with simple elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, elements forged in ancient stars long before Earth existed. When those stars exploded, they scattered their ashes across the galaxy, ashes that would become planets, oceans, and, eventually, us. But before any creature could crawl, before any plant could grow, these basic elements needed to assemble into life's first ingredients. Scientists call this period the prebiotic era, a time before biology existed, but when the rules of chemistry were already laying the groundwork. In the 1950s, an experiment by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey tried to recreate those early Earth conditions. They filled a glass chamber with gases thought to mimic the primitive atmosphere: methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. Then they added sparks of electricity, simulating lightning. After a week, something incredible appeared inside the flask: tiny droplets containing amino acids, the very building blocks of proteins. In a simple experiment, two scientists had demonstrated that life's chemistry could emerge from lifeless matter. Of course, amino acids alone are not life. They are letters waiting for a language. The question was, how did those letters arrange themselves into words? Lightning storms raged across the early Earth. Volcanoes erupted constantly, spewing minerals into the seas. Meteorites struck the surface, bringing new elements and cosmic dust. Deep below the oceans, hydrothermal vents pumped out scalding, mineral-rich water into the cold abyss. It was here, in these dark, chemical crucibles, that the ingredients of life began to take shape. The vents acted like natural laboratories, providing both the energy and the structure needed for molecules to react. At first, these molecules were simple: methane, ammonia, and carbon dioxide. But with heat and pressure, they linked together, forming longer and more complex chains: sugars, lipids, and amino acids, the first whispers of biochemistry. Imagine a single droplet of seawater floating in that ancient ocean. Within it, millions of molecules colliding every second, forming, breaking apart, and reforming. Most reactions lead to nothing, but every once in a while, by pure chance, something stable forms, a molecule that can make a copy of itself. And that was the turning point. For the first time, information could be preserved, passed from one molecule to the next. The line between chemistry and life began to blur. The first self-replicating molecules were the bridge between chemistry and life. They didn't have cells or membranes or consciousness. They were strands, fragile, floating structures, built from repeating patterns of atoms. And among them, one kind of molecule began to stand out. It was a molecule capable not only of carrying information, but of making copies of itself. Today, we call it RNA, ribonucleic acid. In modern life, RNA helps carry genetic instructions from DNA to the parts of a cell that make proteins. But long before DNA existed, RNA may have been the main actor in life's early drama. This idea is known as the RNA World hypothesis. In this ancient world, tiny strands of RNA formed spontaneously from simpler chemicals. Some of these strands folded into shapes that allowed them to catalyze reactions, to help other molecules bond or break apart. In other words, they could act a little like enzymes, performing primitive chemistry. And among countless random combinations, one strand eventually learned to copy itself. It wasn't perfect. Errors happened all the time, but with every copy, a few versions survived better than others. The molecules that could reproduce more efficiently began to dominate the soup. This was the first evolution, not of species or creatures, but of molecules. Replication had introduced variation, and variation allowed selection. The basic rules of Darwin's future theory were already at play, billions of years before the first cell ever existed. But life as we know it is more than just molecules floating in chaos. Some scientists believe that this boundary came in the form of lipid membranes. Lipids are special molecules that can spontaneously form spheres when placed in water, tiny bubbles with an inside and an outside. They're the ancestors of cell membranes. Inside these primitive bubbles, RNA and other molecules could be protected from the harsh environment. Reactions that happened inside these compartments could persist longer, and molecules could interact more efficiently. For the first time, chemistry had a home. These structures are sometimes called protocells, the precursors to real cells. They were simple, unstable, and temporal, but they represented a giant leap forward. Now, when a protocell happened to trap a self-replicating RNA strand inside, it gained an advantage. That RNA could make copies, and if the bubble split in two, those copies would be inherited by both offspring. It was reproduction on a cellular scale, the first hint of true life. The ocean was full of these microscopic experiments, each one a different version of the same basic pattern: a bubble, some chemistry, and a flicker of replication. Most failed within seconds or minutes. But the ocean didn't care. It had time, millions of years of it. With each cycle of creation and destruction, the molecules that lasted just a little longer passed on their advantages. Some RNA strands began to cooperate, forming small networks that worked together. One strand might specialize in copying, another in storing energy. Slowly, chemistry was learning teamwork. This cooperation was the seed of complexity. As protocells became more stable, they began to harvest energy from their environment, perhaps from sunlight or from the chemical gradients near volcanic vents. One day, one of these microscopic bubbles found a way to capture energy efficiently, to trap it in molecules like ATP, the same molecule every living cell still uses today. With energy came stability, and with stability came persistence. The line between random chemistry and organized life had finally been crossed. By this point, around 3.8 billion years ago, Earth's oceans were alive with invisible activity. Still no plants, no animals, no complex forms, just endless colonies of microscopic life, multiplying in the dark. These first true living things were prokaryotes, cells without nuclei, simple and small. They fed on the chemicals around them, absorbing energy directly from their environment. They were the ancestors of bacteria and archaea, the two great domains of early life. Though invisible to the naked eye, their influence would soon reshape the entire planet. They began to release gases as waste, hydrogen, methane, and eventually, oxygen. The chemistry of Earth was about to change forever, but that is a story for another time. The young Earth was quiet now, at least on the surface. The great bombardment of asteroids had slowed, and continents of dark rock began to peak above the endless oceans. The sky was heavy with clouds and haze, and the air was still toxic to anything that would one day breathe oxygen. But beneath the waves, life had taken hold. The first living cells, tiny, simple, and ancient, were multiplying, each one a world unto itself, carrying the secrets of replication and survival. They drifted through the oceans, feeding, dividing, and spreading. These early cells were prokaryotes, the ancestors of all bacteria and archaea. They were built to endure extremes. Some thrived in scalding vents at the bottom of the ocean, where superheated water burst from cracks in the crust. Others lived in shallow pools, rich in minerals and energy. They didn't need oxygen. They didn't need sunlight. They fed on chemistry itself, using reactions between water, iron, and sulfur to extract energy. This world of microbes was alien compared to our own, but it was thriving. And somewhere among these countless microscopic pioneers, a few began to experiment with a new trick, one that would change the course of Earth's history forever. They learned how to capture sunlight. At first, sunlight had been dangerous. The young sun burned harshly, and without an ozone layer, its ultraviolet rays struck the surface unfiltered. But certain microbes began to use sunlight's energy instead of fearing it. They developed tiny structures within their membranes, primitive pigments capable of absorbing light and using it to power chemical reactions. This was the birth of photosynthesis. At first, it was a crude version, using molecules like hydrogen sulfide instead of water. But it worked. Light could now be turned into energy, a limitless supply, free for any microbe clever enough to use it. Then came an even more revolutionary step. Some microbes evolved the ability to use water itself in the process. They split water molecules apart, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. It was an innovation so powerful that it would reshape the entire planet. The first photosynthetic bacteria, called cyanobacteria, spread through the oceans like wildfire. They were small, blue-green in color, and their success created the first true ecological boom on Earth. But their triumph came with an unintended side effect. Their waste product, oxygen, began to build up in the seas and sky. At first, it reacted with iron in the water, forming vast layers of rust that would later become iron ore deposits. But over millions of years, the reaction slowed, and the oxygen had nowhere else to go. It began to fill the atmosphere. For early life, oxygen was deadly. To these ancient anaerobic cells, oxygen was a poison, a reactive gas that destroyed their delicate chemistry. Entire populations were wiped out as oxygen levels rose. This mass extinction, the first in Earth's history, was caused not by an asteroid or volcano, but by life itself. And yet, from this disaster came opportunity. Some microbes adapted, learning to tolerate the new gas. A few went even further, learning to use oxygen as a tool to unlock energy from food more efficiently. This innovation would later become aerobic respiration, the process used by almost all complex life today. What had been a toxic byproduct had become a fuel. As oxygen filled the atmosphere, a new layer formed high above the planet, ozone. It absorbed the deadly ultraviolet rays from the sun, shielding the surface below. For the first time, shallow waters and tidal zones became safe for life to expand into. The stage was being set for a new world, a world where complex organisms could evolve. But that future was still billions of years away. For now, the planet belonged to the microbes. They formed vast colonies on the ocean floor, layer upon layer of sticky bacterial mats. As they grew and hardened, they built dome-shaped structures known as stromatolites, some of the oldest fossils ever found. Even today, in remote parts of Australia and the Bahamas, you can still see living stromatolites, quiet descendants of those first architects of life. These bacterial communities were Earth's first ecosystems, self-sustaining, photosynthetic, and stable. They were tiny worlds, capturing sunlight, producing oxygen, and gradually transforming the chemistry of the entire planet. The air we breathe today is their legacy. Every breath, every flame, every heartbeat, all of it possible because of their ancient work, done in silence beneath a red sun billions of years ago. By the end of this age, roughly 2.5 billion years ago, Earth had become something it had never been before, a living planet with an oxygen-rich sky. But the oxygen revolution came at a cost. The planet cooled dramatically. The greenhouse gases that once kept Earth warm were consumed by oxidation, and global temperatures began to fall. Massive sheets of ice crept across the continents. The Earth entered one of its first great ice ages, a frozen consequence of the very life that had made it thrive. Yet even in the cold, life endured. Microbes adapted to the freezing oceans and darkened skies. Evolution continued in quiet persistence, waiting for the day when complexity would return. The world was ready for its next great leap, the rise of complex cells, and eventually the first multicellular life. The Earth had changed forever. The oceans that were once suffocating and dark now shimmered under skies tinted with oxygen. Continents were larger, mountain ranges were rising, and the seas were rich with minerals. Yet beneath the waves, life was still invisible. tiny, microscopic, and simple. But not for long. After billions of years of evolution, the rules were beginning to shift. The age of chemistry was ending, and the age of complexity was about to begin. For the first time, some cells began to take the greatest leap evolution had ever seen. They learned to live together. Among the countless single-celled organisms drifting through the sea, a few began to form partnerships. Some engulfed smaller cells not to eat them, but to use them. Inside their hosts, these captured cells continued to live, protected and fed, while providing energy in return. This was not a predator devouring prey. It was cooperation, a new kind of relationship that would change life forever. The smaller cells were most likely oxygen-breathing bacteria, and their hosts were larger anaerobic microbes trying to survive in a newly oxygen-rich world. By joining forces, both found an advantage. The smaller cells could use oxygen to release energy efficiently, and the larger host could harness that power. Over time, they became inseparable. The once independent bacteria evolved into tiny powerhouses called mitochondria, organelles that still live inside every complex cell on Earth today. This partnership marked the birth of the first eukaryotic cells, cells with nuclei, internal compartments, and organized structures. They were the direct ancestors of everything that would follow: plants, fungi, animals, and eventually us. Inside these new cells, DNA was protected within a central nucleus. The cell's inner machinery became more sophisticated, able to store, copy, and express genetic information with precision. The chemistry that once happened in the open sea was now contained and controlled, refined within a microscopic fortress. These cells could grow larger, live longer, and adapt faster. They represented the next level of evolution, a new kind of life built on cooperation, specialization, and complexity. With mitochondria powering them from within, these early eukaryotes began to explore new environments. Some absorbed sunlight and became the ancestors of algae. Others hunted smaller microbes and became the first predators. The tree of life was branching rapidly, and evolution had found a new rhythm. Yet for millions of years, life still remained microscopic. The oceans were full of invisible dramas, cells chasing cells, colonies forming and breaking apart, and gene networks growing ever more intricate. But slowly, a quiet revolution was underway. Some eukaryotic cells began to stay together after dividing. Instead of drifting apart, they remained linked, forming simple colonies where each cell performed a different role. It was the first spark of multicellularity, a simple but profound change that would pave the way for every complex organism to come. Now evolution had an entirely new canvas to paint on. Instead of perfecting the single cell, it could shape entire bodies, structures made of trillions of cooperating cells. The blueprint for animals, plants, and fungi was being drafted in those ancient seas. Meanwhile, oxygen continued to reshape the planet. The ozone layer grew thicker, shielding life from deadly radiation. The atmosphere cleared, and sunlight could finally reach the surface in abundance. The Earth was no longer the fiery, toxic world it once was. It had become a stable, fertile planet, a world ready to host the explosion of life that was soon to come. By 1.8 billion years ago, complex cells were flourishing across the oceans. They existed in countless forms, some solitary, some colonial, and others already experimenting with cooperation. But evolution is patient. It would take another billion years before the first visible creatures would appear, before eyes, fins, shells, and bones would ever form. The stage was set, and all that was missing was the spark of diversity that would ignite the Cambrian explosion. And so from a molten beginning to oceans full of invisible life, the story of Earth had entered a new chapter. The chemistry of creation had become the biology of evolution. What began as dust and fire had become memory, inheritance, and survival. Every living thing today, every tree, bird, fish, and human traces its lineage back to those first fragile strands of RNA, to the ancient bacteria that learned to breathe oxygen, and to the first cell that decided not to live alone. The birth of life was not a miracle that happened once. It was the universe learning how to organize itself, how to replicate, adapt, and endure. And as we look back, across 4 billion years of history, we can see that everything alive today is part of that same unbroken story.